The law is clear that Google, ISPs, and other communication service providers can't turn over information about your communications or the communications themselves to the FBI based on a mere request. Instead, there's a sliding scale. Information that's less sensitive, like subscriber information, your name, your address, but also your credit card number, that information is available to the government with a subpoena that it issues for information that is relevant to an investigation it has opened. No judge signs off on the subpoena. It's just a law enforcement document. For more sensitive information, like a log of your surfing activity on the internet, for that more sensitive information, the government needs a court order issued on an intermediate standard. It's not mere relevance, but rather specific and articulable facts that the information sought is relevant and material to an investigation. For even more sensitive information, like the contents of an email message less than 180 days old, or to intercept information in real time, the government needs a warrant or a court order based on a showing of probable cause. Probable cause is a relatively high standard that the government would prove to a judge in order to get access to that more sensitive information. So the rules, in some sense, track one's expectations. More sensitive data is protected at a higher level, but sometimes those rules break down and no longer reflect an individual's expectations. For example, today, opened email in the government's eyes is protected at a very low subpoena level, even if it's less than 180 days old, whereas email that you haven't opened because it's junk mail is protected at a higher level. That makes no sense. It's something that needs to be fixed in the statute. That's right. For law enforcement to get email to from information or the numbers dialed on a telephone in real time, it needs a pen register or a trap and trace device, and it gets an order from a judge that permits it to install such a device based on a very low showing of proof. All law enforcement has to do is go to a judge and say, we think that the product of this pen register or trap and trace device would be relevant to an investigation we are conducting. Once they make that certification to the judge, the law says that the judge shall issue the order. It doesn't permit him to make inquiries about the basis for law enforcement's determination, but rather it says he shall issue the order when they certify that the information that they seek would be relevant. That's a very low standard. For information like a log about your web surfing activities, there's a higher standard. The government has to prove to the judge specific and articulable facts that the information that it's seeking, the log of your activities on the internet, is relevant to an investigation and material to the investigation. That's an intermediate standard. For information like the content of an email that hasn't been opened and that's less than 180 days old, the standard is relatively high, probable cause. And the government has to prove probable cause to a judge. So you've got this graduated system where, as the information is becoming more sensitive, a higher level of showing to the judge is required. But unfortunately, sometimes it breaks down and doesn't reflect our expectations of privacy today. So for example, under the Department of Justice's current interpretation of the law, if you open an email, all of a sudden it loses the high level of protection, even if it's a newer email. Well, that doesn't make any sense. That would make it so that unopened email, junk mail, is protected at a higher level than the mail you actually read. We've got to fix that and update the statute to do it. We have to be careful in saying that technology dictates the level of protection that's afforded to communications, either for constitutional reasons or for statutory reasons. Reasonable expectation of privacy, it's a constitutional term. And what the court determined was that when one has a reasonable expectation of privacy, law enforcement can breach that privacy, but it has to have a good reason, and normally that good reason is supported by a warrant. Now, the Department of Justice argues that because people are putting more and more information out to the public or out to their friends through social networking and other means, that people have a diminished expectation of privacy, and that therefore the constitutional protections should likewise be diminished. But we think there's a better analysis. And the better analysis is that people do still expect privacy. And there's a difference between a situation in which a person is voluntarily making more information available to the public and a situation in which the government is seeking access to information that the person hasn't made that decision about. They've decided they want to keep it private, but the government would like to get access to it. In that scenario, one's expectation of privacy ought to remain strong. The important thing to remember is that the constitutional protections are based on a document that was written quite a long time ago, and that sometimes it's necessary to fill in the gaps with statutory protections that are strong. And it's also important to keep those statutory protections up to date. That's why we've been asking Congress to update the Electronic Communications Privacy Act to reflect the way that we communicate today. Thanks very much.